In this program, we are going to talk about framing and composition in photography. A photographer may know all the techniques of photography, may know how to take the correct photograph, but at times we are much disturbed when we are not able to get what we call a good photograph. Although this is a very personal kind of a perception, but there is a general sense in us about a good photograph and a bad photograph in terms of its framing and composition. What is composition? Composition is placement of various elements within a frame, where the primary object is kept, where other things are in the frame. A photographer, when he looks through the frame or through the viewfinder, he frames a picture, which means there is a line within which we have to keep all the elements. There is a person, there is a child, there is a background, there is a foreground, there is the sky, there is the land. All objects have to be placed correctly. It is an interesting comparison with painting. A painter starts with a blank canvas and has the liberty to fill in the visual elements which as he or she progresses, therefore completing a picture. It is not so with the photographer in general. A photographer has to look around from the viewfinder and at a certain angle, at a certain height, see and click the picture. There are no fixed rules here, but it is interesting to discuss. There is a pattern. We have come to acknowledge there are certain things work in photography which make a picture stand out. There are techniques in photography, the lens, the shutter speed, which give us greater control on the final look of the picture. The human eye is a very complicated machine which interacts with the brain and makes us look at a print or at a place in a certain way, but it is not so with the camera. The lens with their qualities change the look of the same frame. With certain lens the picture may look very deep and having a lot of depth, with another kind of a lens it may look very flat. So, there are many issues which we need to discuss, that how to compose or how to visualize a picture. A photographer, what does he think when he starts taking a picture? Naturally, a good photographer should be able to visualize the picture before the picture is clicked. After all, a picture should communicate. How does communication work? Communication works when we are sure what we have perceived about the topic or about the frame will be taken or photographed in the best manner possible. The photographer looks through and decides a very simple thing. We pick up the camera and first thing decision we make is, do we take a horizontal frame or do we take a vertical frame? These are issues that we decide at the instant, but there is a kind of a training in photography, a kind of a pattern that we follow to achieve these things. So, it is important for a photographer to visualize before he or she clicks the picture and then pursue that picture. Ultimately, a photograph is a 3D system becoming 2D. When we look through the viewfinder, we are looking at a 3D picture. We should also realize once we click it in a certain way using our understanding of the technique of photography, we are flattening it. So, what issues we should tackle? There are issues that come to our mind around framing the picture. Usually, when we take say a portrait, a person, initially we are just trained to look and click. That I do not think so is a very right thing. A thinking photographer should study the frame, because a frame provides a boundary to a picture. What is within the boundary, how our main person, say if we are taking a person, a child or a man or a girl, where that person is placed so that it gets prominence. Usually as amateurs we look, we see the person and we click, we do not see what is happening around it, or at times we see the person and we include the whole person and take a picture. Maybe a picture would have been more interesting if we would have gone a bit closer and just frame the head. A person may have interesting expressions, but in our excitement of taking a picture we take the whole frame. Issues: one should never rush into a photograph. With the digital era we are getting more and more rushed, because we know we can do things after taking a picture or we can delete a picture. No, I do not think so, this is the right thing to do. One should study the frame, because the mind interacts with the camera, the mind interacts with what one sees, the mind interacts and sees a lot of things which please or displease. There is an aesthetic training within us culturally that we have grown up with. Within a frame also we see patterns, lines and spots which make us frame the picture in a certain way. The rule of thirds is a very basic rule of composition. What is the rule of thirds? I think most of you would be knowing. There is a rectangular frame. If we cut it horizontally into equal lines or vertically into equal lines, the important subject should be somewhere at the intersection of those lines. That is where the eye travels. That is where it makes the thing powerful. You can try that and see for your own self that at those intersections is where the eye travels and enjoys or arrests the look of the picture. It does not, it may not, I mean we are not used to culturally placing things at the central line. It always has to be at the intersection of those lines. So these are laws of photography which make photography, the basic understanding of photography or basic understanding of creating a pleasant picture even more exciting. Though one should follow in these things, one should follow one's intuition rather than think of laws and rules. A very important rule of photography is that background and foreground should not clash. When I take a picture, my primary subject should be at the center of the picture. I should be careful that there is nothing in the background which is disturbing. I should eliminate that. I should move in a certain manner that the distractive background is removed. There are ways to do that. There are techniques to do that. As photographers, we have studied the idea of depth of field. Using a shallow depth of field eliminates or throws the background out of focus. If we still have to include the background, we may have the background, but we may have it thrown out of focus, which makes the primary character stand out. On another hand, there can be a scene where you want to show everything in the frame, from foreground till background. It may be a documentary on a classroom, on a school that you are doing. We have to show that there are 100 people sitting in the class. Then we can employ higher depth of field or a great depth of field to show the student crisply who is in the first row to the student who is in the background. Lenses play an important role here also. A wide angle lens we know has a great depth of field. Therefore, it allows us to show everything in sharp focus, whereas a long focal length lens itself has a shallow depth of field and allows us to throw things out of focus. This is a technique. In fact, as you may know, a telephoto lens is supposed to be a good portraiture lens also. Why? Because you can involve this shallow depth of field and really highlight certain features, maybe somebody's eyes, and throw the ears out of focus. So techniques in photography work very well in enhancing or reducing certain aspects of the frame. Juxtaposition. At times when I look at a frame, there is a foreground background which is very contrasty. Contrast works, not just contrast in terms of light, yes, that is also very interesting. The subject can be in light and the background may be in much lesser light, therefore the subject stands out. But right now I was talking about contrast in the subject itself. I have to show a picture of, say, poverty in India. My primary subject is a child who is a rag picker. I can juxtapose a frame or frame the picture in such a way that it is in contrast against a rich person, which will heighten the feeling of poverty. The poor child's poverty will be exaggerated if a rich man's child is eating an ice cream behind us. So one has to move around with the frame and see and fix the frame in the right manner, so that what works and what does not work. Psychologically, we are trained to trace lines and patterns within a frame, movement within a frame. What pleases us, if there is a tree, what are the lines, where are they travelling? If there is a door, what kind of a repetition those lines are making. Usually we say in photography that vertical lines give us a kind of a strength kind of a feeling, whereas horizontal lines are calming. A very regular example is shooting the horizon or shooting the landscape, where if we just go and place a picture in a certain way that half of it is divided up in the sky, the other half is down, it looks pretty awkward. Nobody takes a picture with a 50-50 kind of a frame. It looks that within one frame you have two separate frames. A general picture of shooting landscape, say an ideal picture on the coast, is keeping 2/3 of sky and 1/3 of ground. That has a pleasing calming effect on us and it makes a complete picture. Lines are an interesting part. Lines should travel in rather than traveling out. Motion should travel in. I mean it may sound a personal perception, but my eye always roves and goes and stops at a point in the frame. That is where I find a strength in the picture. If eye is roving around and is unable to find a fixed frame, a spot to relax, I find that a disturbing picture. Usually if there is a car travelling, it should be travelling into the frame rather than travelling outside the frame. If even there is a sports person, it should be running into the frame. If it is on the edge of the frame with motion running, taking the person out of the frame, it becomes disturbing. Here I would also want to mention the issue of perspective. What is perspective? Perspective is the feeling of depth in a picture. If there is an object close to the frame and there is another object far away from the frame, they may be just two people, we get a sense of depth because the closer one looks much bigger than the person far away. Perspective is related to depth. Perspective is also related, it gives us the feeling of depth in a 2D frame. One moves close, and when one shoots landscape or when one shoots a crowded place, to heighten that perception of space, one uses a person or a tree closer to the frame and another far away. The size of the far away tree will be much smaller than the person close away, exaggerating the sense of depth. Technically, wide angle lenses are useful for shooting this kind of depth. In fact, if you see advertisements of say a car, people shoot it with wide angle lenses to show space and depth in a car, because wide angle also allows you to go closer to a subject. A tele does not. In a tele frame you have to be away from the subject, therefore things look much close by, therefore there is no sense of depth and there is a sense of flattening of the image. With a wide angle there is a sense of depth in the image. Even if there is a fence running and we shoot that fence sitting close to the fence on a farm and the fence is running away, or maybe it is a railway track which is running away, if you shoot it by the wide angle lens being closer to the track looks really deep and far away. This is a heightened exaggeration because you are able to move close to the track and see them almost converging, you feel a sense of depth. Perspective is another thing that one should keep very sharply in mind while framing a picture. That allows us also to choose the right lens and the right technique. I also should talk about motion as a technique. Motion blur happens because when you use a slow shutter speed, that creates a kind of a blur in moving objects, but if your primary character is static, the static character is frozen. This also throws the moving objects within the frame into a kind of a fuzz, into a kind of a unsharpening, whereas the object in frame is very sharp. People use this technique in framing moving objects very well to give the sense of motion, athletics, etc. You pan a picture at a slow shutter speed so that you have the running person in frame, but the background which was static gets blurred. That is how on a still frame one feels or gets a perception of motion. If you photograph a train, a moving train or a bus with a slow shutter speed, that will be a blur. That is not what we want. We want to move with the moving object so that the moving object stays frozen and the static object, because the camera was moving, becomes a blur. It creates a strong feeling of motion. Photography is about conveying the content, communicating the picture. Is it just a picture? Can be a journalistic picture where a message is being sent, therefore it should have an emphasis on the subject. The subject should be central, other things around it may be happening, but the person or the issue to be conveyed must be very central. Whereas another kind of picture can be an abstract picture. There is art photography, there is landscape photography, where we look at say things like balance. What is a balanced frame? A picture should be so composed that the lines and the spots and the patterns which we are seeing do not tilt in one direction or the other. We should have a calming or a pleasing effect. Contrast in light is a very important issue that I mentioned earlier. Contrast, either you use harsh and sharp light and use very strong stiff lines conveyed through shadows, or you use a pale kind of a light, a cool kind of a light, where everything is, there is a multi-tonality, there are all shades of grey or there are all shades of color which have an overall effect. But to have a strong frame, photographers tend to use strong contrast. Blacks become even blacker and whites become even whiter. Light, naturally, I mean, as I mentioned many times earlier, light is a very important part, and light, because without light there can be no photography, but a photographer has to position himself so that in the available light, if he is using available light, how the lines and shadows create those patterns which are best suited to his advantage or his or her advantage. Light creates texture, the way light grazes the surface, the way light, if it is a very front kind of a light, it can be a very what we call a flat picture, but if we have a light which is cutting the wall, it creates those minor patterns on the wall. The minor shadows that are created can again highlight the subject, be it a simple wall or somebody's texture or skin, and convey its message. A road can be shown as a very smooth road because of a bad kind of a lighting, or we have not used the camera from the same angle, but if you want to show a bad road, you can highlight the texture of the road by placing yourself in comparison or with the light in such a way that all the bumps of the road are very well shown. So these are techniques where we use well in photography to convey our messages. Frames, as I had mentioned earlier, framing horizontally, vertically, there are square frames, or ultimately when you print the picture it can become a horizontal frame can be made into a vertical frame. But a good photographer always conceives these things well in advance to take or convey the message that he or she is looking for. Lines, as I mentioned, repetition is something else, repetition of form, of space, again using the techniques of photography like a proper lens. There are distortions in the lens. I also would want to say here that what our eye normally sees does not really please in a photograph. We want to see something quirky, something different. Distortions in lenses are used very well by photojournalists, etc., to heighten the effect of compression or curvature. A wide angle lens has this issue of curvy linear distortions, things on the edge start pressing or becoming roundish. You may have seen such pictures in photojournalism where a photographer is very close, but the scene is kind of exaggerated on its corners or it's bending on the corners. This is done because the lens itself has this quality of curvy linear distortion, and it distorts or presses the curves. So the picture looks slightly out of shape. Cinema again uses these current Bollywood cinema, Hollywood uses a lot of these lens techniques to make the picture interesting, something queer or quirky happening which we do not see from our normal eye, but we see on the picture, which is actually enhanced because of the kind of lens we are using. There is perspective distortion. Lines look as if merging if they are far away. I talked about perspective earlier. When we look up into, if you are photographing a tower, say the Qutub Minar, and you look up and take a picture from close, it will look a very tall object because the lines seem to be merging. Some photographers would use that to their advantage, though there are techniques to correct those perspectives also. So composition is something very wide. It is a personal perception also. I may like a certain picture and you may not like. I mean, there are lots of photographers whose style of photography I do not enjoy, but they are very well known photographers because their style of composition is such that that does not go well with my understanding of photography. But that does not mean I I am saying all this also because as a student one must know the rules to break them. One can start doing things which may not be usual, may be unusual and therefore pleasing to somebody's perceptions, but in general there are certain rules that are followed. And as I said in the beginning, therefore one should conceive the picture, one should almost see the picture before it is clicked, and this will only happen once you will look through the viewfinder, and when once you are looking the viewfinder, the important issue here is also the vantage point, the point of view that you are choosing. Again, as I said earlier, the regular eye level point of view is usually not very exciting to a photographer or as a photograph. We tend to go really down or go really up. The world likes another point of view. I would like to see a bird's eye view of the world because I can't fly. I would love to see that. So there are point of views which are also represented as vantage points, which make the picture more interesting. So try taking pictures from an angle, move around, try to go to an angle, to bend down, to go on the floor or go up and see the picture. Earlier cameras, which used to be actually waist level cameras, you looked down to take pictures. Now we have cameras which are eye level, but a photographer should, I believe very strongly, explore all angles before choosing the point of view from which the message is best conveyed. An actor, a superstar, is best shown as a superstar in cinema by a low angle camera because his larger than life image becomes more pronounced. Similarly, the aam janta, the regular people, are photographed from top angle, listening to the leader or listening to the hero, because they are the regular people, they are the many millions. Nobody will if you photograph them from the eye level, in any case you will just get heads and the heads behind will be hidden. So you have to go top angle, but by going top angle you are not just showing the millions of heads, you are also looking down on them. There is a certain grammar which is coming. So please remember, ultimately it is about communication. Yes, you have things like patterns and designs, you have things like foreground and background, you have the content in mind and the context in mind that you make the picture, you have techniques as a photographer, technical techniques to exploit more and more now with the digital era while taking a picture, and as well as going on to the computer when you correct the picture. There are many things of that which a photographer, which again intuitively and compositionally come to a photographer, which are also about seeing other people's work. They are also about where you draw your inspiration from. Maybe it's again maybe television and cinema, which we Indians watch a lot, or some great Raghu Rai or some great other photographers' work, that we try to emulate that, and we don't very consciously do that, but it comes to us because it has something which has influenced our mind, because it is aesthetically pleasing, because you like that person's work. So once antennas and once that brings us to finally to the idea that one's antennas and one's perceptions should be open to the world of photography, to seeing more and more people's work, so that how we compose and frame our photographs are enriched by these experiences, by other people's style of shooting. Technology will grow endlessly, but ultimately the person, our eye, will be central to what we want to do, and for that it is good to look at certain basic issues around framing and composition that I talked about, and then try to generate one's own unique image. I think I have spoken at length about composition and framing. One will carry home certain benefits from this lecture. Thank you.